Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for another installment of Exploring Our World, where we here at Colonial Williamsburg dive into the minds and experiences of daily life in the 18th century. In celebration of Women's History Month, all of our Exploring Our World programs this month have focused on the lives of 18th century women. I'm Stacy Loveland, and joining me today are Mary Carter and Emma Cross, and they are both nation builders here at Colonial Williamsburg. Thank you guys for joining us today as we have this conversation about what it's like to interpret actual women from the 18th century. Let's begin with having each of you introduce yourselves and telling us a bit about the individuals you portray.
All right, I'll start. Hi, my name is Mary Carter, and I have been working here at the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation for the last 13 years. And I particularly portray a woman named Aggie of Turkey Island. She was enslaved in Henrico County. She was a mother. She was specifically chosen on that plantation for the intimacy of her master. And she was forced into that role, bore 2 children by the man that enslaved her, and then had to fight for her freedom after that situation. So that is the woman that I portray, and those notes of racism and sexism is the focus of my research here.
My name is Emma Cross, and I have the honor of portraying a woman named Clementine Rind, who lived here in the city from the 1760s to the 1770s. She is probably best known for owning a newspaper after her husband's death and also being a public printer to Virginia. I've also worked here at Colonial Williamsburg for quite some time. I actually got to start as a junior interpreter in our character interpreter department when I was 11. So I've played a variety of characters, all of them who lived here in Williamsburg, and actually on a pretty wide scale. So while I'm working as a tradesperson now, I've gotten the chance to portray people of the past in a variety of different situations.
Well, I'm very excited you both are here with us today. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you, me too.
As we talk today, we are looking forward to answering your questions. So for everyone watching and listening at home, feel free to send in anything you're wondering about. You can post it in the comments down below, and we're going to try and answer as many of those as we possibly can. But before we get started, I have one last note. We do intend to have an open and candid discussion this afternoon, and topics of this conversation may include things like sexual assault, death, and racial iniquities. Some viewers may find these topics challenging, but they are necessary to tell our whole and complete history. If you need to step away for a few minutes and come back, that's quite all right, but we hope you will return to us. All right, to get us started. Last week, for anyone who was watching last Wednesday, my colleague Devia and I shared some of our experience as historic interpreters or third-person interpreters. We also had a few questions come in then about first-person or character interpretation, which is what the both of you do. So would you be willing to tell us about these different styles of interpretation and what it looks like for you guys?
Yeah, in particular, Emma and I both have done third-person work as well as first-person work, but the way that I like to look at it is when I'm doing this work, I am, instead of just talking about the 18th century, I am taking on the persona of this woman. She was a real woman. She really lived, and the history of her life that I imbue into every conversation I have. So when I answer a question, I am speaking for her or speaking in her voice as best as I know it.
Yeah. I think oftentimes we throw around a lot of terminology that might be confusing, and so that idea of third person being essentially having a foot in both the 21st century world and in the 18th century world to be able to provide context no matter what. Our job as first-person interpreters, you might hear us call character interpreters or people of the past. These are all words that essentially mean it's our job to invite you into the 18th century world and kind of look at it as an 18th century world, and we're not going to reference back to the modern time frame, which is providing a whole different way of looking at the 18th century.
Right. You both do a fantastic job of it.
Thank you.
I always love getting to hear you interpret.
Thanks.
Like I said, if you have questions, please feel free to send them in. I do have a few more questions, though, that I'd like answers to and to get us started.
Sure.
What surprised you the most to learn about 18th century women?
I'll jump into this one.
Yeah.
So I think I've had a unique opportunity that I've been researching and portraying and kind of living in the 18th century world since the time I was very, very young. But when I really started to study and understand more, I think more as an adult, one of the things that continues to surprise me, but it shouldn't surprise me because this is how women are anyway, is how completely involved they are in their world. Wherever that world is, whatever level of society they find themselves in, they are completely active participants. And I don't think we could say that enough, is that they are active participants. Mm-hmm. Even when it might seem to us through the eyes of history that they were passive in their participation. They are certainly very active in their communities, in their world, in economics, in society, in politics, the list goes on and on. I think that's, to me, the constantly still surprising thing.
Yeah, and I think just on that same note, it's really the same essence, is the fact that they were there.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of times the history that, and I, unlike him, the 18th century was new to me. I am not from Virginia. I think I visited Colonial Williamsburg once as a child, and I don't even remember if we got tickets to see anything, but,
Yeah.
you know, so this whole world and this history was all new to me when I came here. Mm. But what my experience with history was always through the lens of men, and it was most commonly through the lens of white men. And so for a Black woman, seeing history from the perspective of these women, especially women who were enslaved, mm-hmm. I didn't realize how active they were in their world and what they were doing. They were there and nothing happened without them. And I think about, especially one of the reasons I really appreciate being able to portray a mother is this opportunity to show how these women, in circumstances where their children legally were the property of another person, mm-hmm. they never stopped being their children. Mm-hmm. And the things that they would do as mothers to try to affect and help and ease, even in the smallest way, the cruelties of this institution of slavery is just, it's overwhelming to me to see what these women were going through, but what they were affecting in the meantime. Mm-hmm. So.
Fantastic, thank you. We do have some questions coming in. Kelly has asked a great one, wanting to know where you start with research when you are looking to portray a character. And I'd like to add on, is there anything else you do to prepare to portray someone?
Yeah.
Well, interesting, you know, with research, there's, I think researching to portray a specific individual is a lot different than just talking about the 18th century in general. But mm-hmm. I was really fortunate when I came here to Colonial Williamsburg, and for me, I think it was the best way, because again, I didn't have the background on this particular history. And I, as a third-person interpreter, I just started to get the lay of the land. How does the government work? What are some keynotes about society? Bathroom practices, like just the little basic things about life in the 18th century, to find that out first. Mm-hmm. And then you have to start to build on top of that. I've always looked at it as a skeleton, like a skeletal frame of these details of Aggie's life. And I look a lot to primary sources. And that was one of the things with Aggie. For enslaved individuals, a lot of times we are completely beholden on what their masters or mistresses, the individuals that enslaved them, write down. But they only oftentimes wrote down what was valuable to them. Mm-hmm. They have this skill. Why? Because it was worth something to them. But that's not the entire worth of this person. So trying to find these details. But with Aggie, I found a lot of primary source information that nobody had thought to look up before, because she was this, as I think a lot of historians felt, she was an unimportant character to history. And so they didn't look into this woman's life. But I found court records in Henrico County that have to do with her life, with the case for her freedom and what was going on with her and her children. Even notes of what was going on in that household between her and Ryland Randolph, this man who owned her and this man who fathered her, these two children of hers. And it's really interesting to see that. But it's more than that too.
Yeah.
It's the That's just the skeleton.
Yeah.
Then there's the flesh, right?
It is, and I think there's that thing when you are looking to portray a person of the past, a character, there has to be a reason why, right? So for us as nation builders here at the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, the nation builders that we have usually were chosen for specific reasons, either to tell a certain part of the story or highlight a certain part of history. So usually that's the jumping off point. But, people are complex. History is complex. So that's never the ending point when you find something. So if you're starting to look into the character, just as Mary said, you have to start with that basic framework of understanding the world that they lived in. Even if it is very, very thin veneer of understanding the world they live in, because let's be honest, the world that we live in today in the 21st century, how much do we all actually understand in depth of everything? But you know a little bit about how the government works. You know how your banking works. That's what they would have done in the 18th century. So finding that basis of that framework in secondary sources. Secondary sources usually are, like the books we have beside us here, books that are written by historians, by other folks who are gathering a lot of information, putting it together in subjects, or through primary sources, like Mary just mentioned about the Henrico records. Yeah. For me, I do a lot of reading of Clementine Rind's newspapers, and being able to fold all of that in through the research to then flesh out this person. The difficult thing is we don't know everything about every single person. So there is a little bit of, I think what we have to say is historical, I don't want to say guesswork because it's not guesswork, but it's informed historical opinion where we know that in this situation, a lot of these types of things were happening. So you have to be able to research that. And Mary alluded to the other half of preparing yourself to be this person, is that you are literally stepping into the shoes of someone who lived. And for me, I oftentimes think, well, if someone for whatever reason portrayed me in 200 years, how would I want them to handle the things that I feel deeply about? And I always think about that with Clementina. I always think about what she must have felt was important, because I don't want to disrespect her or anybody who we portray, and how we do that today.
That's fantastic. I see a lot of questions coming in. Thank you all. Keep sending those in. Everyone seems very interested in exactly what you're talking about. We had a couple of questions coming in that you were answering them as they were being posted.
Awesome.
I know Margaret specifically was asking more about the sources you're looking at, things like newspapers, and when you have to fill in details from other sources. So you already addressed that, but I know before we went live on air today, we were talking and had been discussing something that I thought was really interesting. I had asked you if you could have any primary source that may or may not exist, if you could just magically have it, what primary source would you want? Mary, do you want to start?
I would really love a journal written by Aggie in her own hand, and I want to know everything. I want all the details. I was saying before, it's like I want pictures in the margins, and I want descriptions of what things smelled like. I want to know if the river was high that day, and I want to know how everything, all these pieces of her life, how they happened, because I mentioned that skeletal frame that I build up, and then I fill it in with these other details. But there are some very key details of what happens at Turkey Island Plantation that I don't know, that I can't know, and I just pray. I pray because this is a real woman, this is a real life, and I pray that I'm not getting it wrong. And so, and there's days that I break down and I'm sure that I have gotten it wrong, So it's very hard to know that I'm dealing with, especially when I'm dealing with the trauma aspect of being an enslaved person. This is very real trauma on her family, on the people that she loved, on the people in her community. And I don't take that lightly at all. But, when you have all these accounts from these different perspectives, what exactly is it like when you're experiencing a whipping or you're watching it? Violence, those sorts of things. I want to know everything. And so... but I don't have her words.
Yeah, I would have to agree. I want a in-depth journal about everything. We think, it's like 80% sure, one letter that survives from Clementina when she's 15. And I know I was very different when I was 15 to what I am today, so it's not what her grown-up life probably reflected. So yeah, the in-depth. I think of anyone who I have portrayed, I don't think I've ever known exactly what they looked like, an exact description of them. So I think not only would I love her journal or her day-to-day account book, I'd also love a drawing of her made by someone who knew her. Yeah.
Those things would be incredible to have.
Yeah.
I think any historians watching today, they'd add those to their wish lists too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have to say this just right now. If you do keep a diary or a journal, as historians, please write down everything.
Everything.
The mundane stuff, even if you don't think it'll be interesting to anybody else, who knows? We were talking about earlier the idea of people destroying letters in the 18th century because of intimate details like that. Specifically talking about Martha Washington and how sometimes she gets a lot of flack for destroying letters between her and the general. But I understand that. I mean, I wouldn't want people to read my private love letters. That's intimate. So I think there's an understanding of why some of these things didn't survive, but then of course some of these things don't survive because one, they're not there, or two, they're lost to history.
Right.
Very true. Right, well, since there are gaps that sometimes need to be filled in because we don't have all those letters, we don't have that day-to-day, how high was the river, what did things smell like account. Carly is asking, when a visitor asks you something that you don't have research on, that you just can't possibly know the answer to, what do you do? How do you handle that in character?
If you wouldn't.
I was going to say, there will always be that sweet little child who comes up and wants to know your favorite color.
Oh, yeah.
And you can't not tell them what your favorite color is. You need to have a favorite color. So there are some things like that where you do need to think, okay, what do I know about the 18th century? What do I know about this person, the world they lived in, people's opinions, people's likes and dislikes? And using all of that basis of content knowledge, you can make an informed decision, even about something as simple as what your favorite color is. Which, by the way, if anybody wants to know, Mrs. Rind's favorite color is Prussian blue, because that also happens to be my favorite color. So. But it's an 18th century color that people really liked. So there's that idea, when it's things like that, you can make an informed decision. When it's things like intimate details about this woman who lost her husband in the prime of his life, but I don't know what she felt about that. She lost him probably less than 2 years after she lost one of her sons, who was 2 years old when he passed away of a childhood disease. I don't know what she felt about that, but I also know that the loss of a loved one is a universal feeling. And and now I've not had the opportunity to be married or to have a child, but talking to people who feel those things, that's what you base those small things off of.
Yeah.
Well said.
Thank you.
Doug is asking about how we get here in the first place. How do we arrive at different individuals being portrayed? And specifically, for you guys, do you get to choose who you're portraying, or is Colonial Williamsburg, is your department, your supervisor, someone assigning a different individual to you? How much leeway do you have in that? And if it is the latter, if you're being told, we'd like you to portray this person, how much latitude are you given in those decisions?
That's a really good question.
Yeah.
And I can speak about it from probably two perspectives. One, I often get asked if I chose Aggie as a role, and I didn't, and I wouldn't have because I didn't think she was an option. But I was researching her before I was assigned her, and I was assigned her specifically because of the subject of where the races mix. As a mixed race woman myself, I have one white parent and one black parent, and So I was already researching and portraying other individuals who were primarily the children of these crossings, both positive and negative, of course. And so I was already in that world a little bit, and so I think they wanted to delve into that subject. It was a particular aim that they had, so they went in that direction. But I also can speak to it from a perspective of I was a supervisor helping individuals choose roles, and it was between myself and them a collaboration, and it was a conversation. One, I'm never going to assign somebody a role. Now, of course, there's going to be individuals that we're going to want to have portrayed here because they were here, they were very involved in a particular, there's going to be a reason why we want this person portrayed at Colonial Williamsburg, we want this story told. I think Gowan Pamphlet is one of those great examples. Yeah. You know, this enslaved man who is a Baptist preacher, I think there always should be a space here for him. But
and he lived in Williamsburg. If anyone hasn't visited us
Right,
and gotten to talk with Gowan Pamphlet here in person, he's in Williamsburg. He's not just an incredible story.
Right,
He's
and
here.
the church that he started is still here, is still a fixture here in this community with a strong congregation today. And I think, so that's a perfect example of one that I don't think should ever not be portrayed. But I also would talk to folks about what their interests were, right?
Yes.
So if you are looking at two different characters and one of them is a mother of 12 children and the other one is in and out of the courts all the time, but you have an interest in legal history, but you don't want to ever have children, I'm not going to assign you the mother of 12. I'm going to assign you one where you can talk about how women interact with the law, right? So, but it's not an assignment, is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
It's a conversation.
It is. And with us nation builders, most of the time you are being hired into a specific role with the Nation Builder department. So with us, like I did not have a choice about Clementine Rind. Well, I did because I decided to apply. I guess that's a good point.
That's true.
And as Mary just said, that's so important. There has to be something that interests you about the character.
A connection.
I am going to say this, though. I think it is extremely, extremely important if you ever portray a person of the past, is that you cannot be completely head over heels in love with them.
Yes.
And I say in love with them for a very specific reason, because people are complex, and 18th century history is complex. And if you're trying to portray them as they were in the 18th century, you have to be able to occasionally disagree with the things that they have to say. Yeah. The thing that drew me to Clementina was that she was a tradesperson, and I love trades and material culture. And I was able to then learn even more about her. But I like what you said, Mary, about it being a conversation, because it really is.
Yeah. That's wonderful. You kind of started touching on this, Emma. I'd like to know a bit more on how you balance your own modern experiences and everything you've seen, any bias you might have when you're interpreting 18th century history. I mean, you've started alluding to this, but what do you personally do to help smooth that out?
It's hard.
It is, because the truth is everybody has bias. We all have passions or things that we're really defensive about. Every single one of us has those, of course. But how do we avoid that getting into our work? And I'll say, because I just explained, I'm the daughter of something that I have changed in my interpretation is terminology. And specifically the phrase interracial relationship, which you'll see in books written by historians all over the place, the phrase interracial relationships, and it's one that I no longer use, but I did when I began portraying Aggie. Because in my mind, I'm like, a relationship is just about how two people relate to one another. I looked at it very clinically, which was, I was able to ration this out. But then I thought to myself, I realized I'm the daughter of what I would describe as a healthy interracial relationship. I think my parents are getting close to 50 years now married, I myself am in a mixed race relationship with my husband. And I would also describe that as a positive relationship. And then I also realized, and this happened when I was interacting with guests. When I'd get out of character and I would say something like interracial relationships, I realized that I was then having to fight uphill to explain the complexity of being an enslaved woman and having no choice as to where you spent your nights. I'm talking about rape and violence, and I realized people were not seeing that. And then I thought to myself, and I realized, and I had some people I really respect challenge me on it, and that helps a lot. You need other people to sharpen you. And I kept thinking about it, and I was like, no, it's about how they relate to one another. But the truth of the matter is today, when we talk about relationships, if we're in a bad relationship, and if we are able, we remove ourselves from that relationship. We separate ourselves from the person that is a bad relationship for us. For an enslaved individual, you cannot separate yourself from a bad relationship. You cannot pull yourself away from the person who owns you as property. You're stuck in that circumstance, and you have to make the best of whatever you've got. And so I realized relationship was not the right term. I now prefer to refer to it as sex across the color lines, because that is specifically what we're talking about. And I'll tell you, like, I've seen some situations where, you know, it's very clear that these individuals chose to be together. I was talking before we came on about a woman in Virginia who not only cohabitates with a black man, even though it is against the law for whites and blacks to be in relationships like this. They're not allowed to legally be married. But the whole community accepts that these two are together, so much so that she's referred to by his last name. And so you do see that. But again, the mixing of the races, the history of that in this nation is rife with violence. And it is dark, and it is ugly. And when I used the phrase interracial relationships, I realized that I had a huge hurdle to overcome to talk about that darkness. And it set me on a wrong path. So I had to change my bias in order to tell the right story.
There's a philosophy in interpreting that is oftentimes supported by a man named Tilden that comes with the idea of, now he says the guest is sovereign. Sometimes I like to think of it as the listener is sovereign. And essentially what that means is that you are providing information, but the person is envisioning that totally separately. And when we're talking about putting our own modern opinion on top of the people that we're portraying, that too, because you, the person, are also applying what you feel to those things. I know you run into this. I've certainly run into this. There are things that Mrs. Rind believes and talks about, and her opinions that are vastly different than Emma's. Take the idea of voting, for example. You know, I know historically women like her viewed it very differently than I do. She viewed it as a privilege. I view it as a right. And so being able to understand that you cannot escape your own bias, but understanding the worldview of the 18th century as we look at all of these heavy, complex, but also very human connections that connect us to the past. It's a constant checking in with yourself too.
Yeah, and with each other.
Yes.
We help each other. So
That's wonderful to be able to have, you know, such the community that we have here, where you have that constant feedback.
Yes.
We have some more fantastic questions coming in. Dory has asked, kind of going off of what we were talking about, not just what we're checking in ourselves, but also what are you learning as you portray these individuals, specifically what you're learning from the women you're portraying that you apply to your life today. So instead of what are you blocking from the modern day, what are you taking from someone from the past and using to help you?
What a lovely way to ask that question. That's beautiful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
yeah, that was a good question.
Wow. I think when I started portraying Clementine Rind, I thought of her very differently than how I portray her today. As I mentioned before, I don't have kids. She had lots of them. And I think one thing that I have drawn from her is the amount of grace that she must have had. But also, this woman was really smart. Like, she was a smart cookie. And she's talked about in her obituary that is written by someone anonymous in the community. They write this really long poem about her, and they talk about her as being a woman blessed by the muses. And that phrase to me has captivated my mind. What does it mean in the 18th century to be blessed by the muses, to be filled with grace and music and you know, this kind, virtuous person? So I think probably the thing I would have drawn the most from is just what strong of a person she had to have been. And gosh, I really wish she lived longer than she did. Oh, that bugs me.
Yeah. What am I learning? Like, what have I learned from Aggie? Oh, so many things. I get tired. I get tired of the weight of this work, this research. I get tired of being a Black woman in America. I get tired of racism. I get tired of ugliness. I get exhausted, bone tired, to the point of I just don't want to fight anymore. And then I am reminded of this woman, this mother who had the promise of freedom in front of her. When I was born with it, and she had this promise of freedom in front of her, and no one around her at that moment felt that she deserved it. They didn't feel that she deserved the freedom that she had been promised, that she and her children were not worthy of freedom. And this is in a community of people who had just fought for their freedom from England, from tyranny, they were saying. And they didn't feel that she was worthy of it because it affected their lives. Letting her go was an inconvenience to them, to their families, and the inheritance that they wanted to keep for themselves. And in the midst of this community and all of that weight of other people's opinions, she just fought. She fought. She fought when she stood on the auction block and was auctioned with her children in her arms. She fought when she stood in front of the courts and challenged one of the most powerful families in Virginia. She fought when she argued for her children's right to have something from the man that fathered them, something to live on, and that they shouldn't be anybody else's slaves, so that the choices she wasn't allowed to make with her own body were not taken away from her children. And she kept fighting. And I get tired. And I break down. There are other children today that are still struggling to be seen as worthy, to be able to live without judgment, to be seen as part of the community that they were born into. I get tired, but Aggie kept fighting, and so I'll take my breaths when I need them, but I'll keep fighting. We all have to keep fighting. It's still in this community. The ugliness that kept Aggie down is still in this community, and we still have to fight for it. We still have to fight through it, and we still have to eliminate it.
Hear, hear.
So, thank you guys for highlighting that too. I think one of the things I very much enjoyed over the past month, especially being involved with some of the live streams, watching the rest of them, I keep hearing the same theme repeated of not just the incredible stories we're seeing, women being strong and fighting and persevering coming out of the past, but also how applicable they are to so much that we have today. And I think that's one of the things that makes what we do here, especially what you guys get to do, so wonderful, is that we can make very human, very real connections to the past, and that's something that's exciting to be a part of. For everyone watching, please still feel free to keep sending in questions. Those great answers came from a question, so we'll take more of them. We do have a few more that came in recently. Tamara is asking, what's the hardest question that you've ever been asked?
Oh, Tamara, that is a really good question.
Is that the hardest question, having to pick one?
The hardest question. I guess there's a couple of different ways to look at this, because to my mind, this pops up with, what is the hardest question to answer in character? Which for me is, how did you die? Because it's really hard to be like, well, let me think about how I'm going to die. So that can be difficult. There can be questions that are just really challenging to try to take, because you understand what someone is asking, but it is our responsibility to take that question and turn it into basically an 18th century way of responding to the question. So that can be hard, because you never really know what people are going to ask and what they're going to be interested in, what they want to know more about. I think one of the hardest questions for me, there's two. There's two hard questions. One of the hardest questions, I think, for a conversation to come out of is the idea of what it meant to have rights and privileges in the 18th century. A lot of people look at the character I portrayed, this woman that I portray, as someone who had absolutely no rights in the 18th century, which is just not true. She does. She's a freeborn English woman. She is endowed with all of the rights that freeborn English men have. Not the privileges, but the rights. Except she's kind of holding a government office. So that kind of, again, enters into the idea of, we were talking about this earlier, of what the law is, what people actually do, and what people really let happen. Right. So I think that's one of the hardest things, is to get people to meet me with the idea of, not only is this person impacting her community, but she had the right legally, but also societally, to do this. So oftentimes that can be a challenging question to understand. Because honestly, if you asked Mrs. Rind, why do you own property? She would have gone, why not? She wouldn't have understood. But that's kind of our responsibility as interpreters, is not just to answer as the person would have answered, but to answer with understanding of context. So for her to say, and you may have heard me say this, well, yes, of course I own property, and this is why. So that's kind of the challenge of being an interpreter as well.
Yeah, and I think for me, there were a number of questions I get in that are difficult to answer. But the thing is that what I've really learned is that I'm always trying to figure out exactly what is the question they've asked.
Yes.
And I've never been asked, I don't think I've ever been asked a question where I'm like, this doesn't warrant an answer. But sometimes I don't always understand what the question is. Mm-hmm. And it's complicated, and I talk about very personal subjects, and I talk about these, especially when I talk about sexual violence. I do that knowing full well that I am likely encountering individuals in my audience who have experienced sexual violence, and so I'm constantly mindful of that. So I spend a lot of time watching my audience mm-hmm. and trying to figure out where they're at and what exactly they're asking. One difficult question I get is the question, do you love him? They'll ask me as Aggie if she loves this man, Ryland Randolph. And I don't say yes, but I'm always trying to figure out exactly why and what it is that they're asking. I remember one man, he asked it in the strangest way. And he was an older gentleman, and he asked, how many times do you stay with him in a week? Like, how many times are you in the room with him? And I thought he was asking a very overwhelmingly intimate question about actual engagement. And I was like, okay. And I took a moment, and I realized, and then he explained he'd been married for, over 50 years to his wife, and he could not imagine sleeping in a different space from her. He couldn't imagine sleeping in a different bed. He was asking if she loved him, if it was love. And I told him, I was like, I'm there when he wants me to be there. I'm there when I'm required, and it is always on his terms. And then he understood the complication of it. And I, for my own personal philosophy, I do not portray this as a loving relationship. It's complicated, and she is making do with what she's got, because she doesn't have a choice in the situation. She has a choice in how she handles it, and I do believe that Ryland gains affection for her. I don't see his actions and what he does in trying to free her and the children as something that came out of nowhere or came out of guilt. I don't even see that. But it's really hard to answer that question, and I realize that people are relating. They're relating to us, or they're relating to people in our story. And generally, I'm asked that question by white men who are having a difficult time relating to Aggie and all of the difficulties that she had. And I understand that. So I just try to lead through these questions as best I can with where they're at. I don't fault anyone. I've had people ask me questions that are clearly racist, but they come from racist viewpoints that they maybe have held, and they don't know where to put them. So we talk through that.
Yeah.
A lot of people have racial biases that they still don't know how to deal with, and Mary doesn't always respond really well to those when they come at me, but I do feel it's my responsibility to help people with those here. Yeah. If you're trying to work on it, I'm with you. I'm ready to work with you on it, but that's just how I feel about it. I feel that I'm supposed to try to help people understand this society and how that relates to their own life.
That's wonderful. I know that question kind of brings up a lot of some of the joys of working here, just those rewarding moments when you can make a connection, find that difficult answer, but also some of the really, really difficult things where sometimes it's exhausting, sometimes it's draining, sometimes you can't get the answer you want to. And Stacy, there's another Stacy out there, hello. Stacy has asked, in your off hours, do you spend time in Colonial Williamsburg, or do you need to distance yourself, have that separation from work like a lot of people do? And she also asks, what is your favorite thing to participate in when you are regular guests? And I know you both participate in things in the historic area in a number of capacities, so I'll let you interpret that second part as you wish.
No, I never think about the 18th century when I'm not at work. I literally am thinking of the book that's on my nightstand that I'm reading before I go to bed, which is about printing. So
oh gosh,
I have a completely healthy work-life balance. It can be hard, especially when you are pretending to be somebody else for 8 hours a day. It can be really hard to put them down. But I think you would agree with me. I think most everybody else who portrays somebody of the past is that you have to. You have to put them down, and you have to step away. Yep. You have to step away from the 18th century world, and you have to live your own. Because there's totally different things, and you do get exhausted, you get tired. So it is important to kind of remember to leave the newspapers in the office and not to take them home with you and read them and highlight them and etc. Okay. So there's that. I don't know, Mary, do you have...
I have to put it away.
Yeah.
I have to put it away. I used to, sometimes read things when I wasn't here and stuff, but I can't. I cannot do it. I have 2 children at home, and if I am looking up from a script that I'm working on, or I'm looking up from a book that I'm working on, they're more likely to see Aggie than they are to see their mother. So I try to put that away, and it's like, even if I'm, all of us are sometimes, teleworking from time to time, it's like, I have to tell my son, it's like, I am working right now. I'm working, and I have to finish this work, and then I will be with you. So there's a complete separation that has to be made. Yeah. And he's also working from home doing his schooling. So, he's starting to understand that there's times where mom's available and there's times where she's not. But there's a part of this that I don't get to put away. And so I can leave my costume. I leave it here at work. It does not come home with me. And I go home, and I'm a different person. I look a lot like this. I wear my hair down as much as I can when I'm not in the office and when I'm not in costume, because this is who I am. And but I always have to tuck it up as Aggie. But I don't get to leave here and not be a Black woman in America. And so I'm going to hear news stories of difficult things that are going on in the community, of the still lingering racism in our society. And so I have to reserve mental, emotional energy to deal with that and fight with that on a different front. So I try to keep Aggie here as much as possible, but I can't say that she's not always with me in some way, some fashion.
Yeah.
And
because we know them so intimately. That they're always gonna be. That sounds really strange, but they you know them.
Yeah. Even like just with my kids, Aggie was different for me when I portrayed her before I had children. So it changes everything.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we are running really short on time, but I do want to get one last question in. This is our last live stream for Women's History Month. It's been a great month, but tomorrow is the start of April. And so since this is our last program, do either of you have any 30 seconds of parting thoughts as we conclude our special focus on women's history this month?
Yeah, you want to go first? You want me to go first?
You go ahead.
Okay. I would say on parting thoughts on women's history and kind of moving forward to the rest of the year, I think it's something that I've definitely learned in my years of interpreting here at Colonial Williamsburg, specifically interpreting as a person of the past, is to imagine and understand history complexly. That there are lots of layers to it, there are lots of different ways of looking at it, there are lots of opinions. Some are valid, some are not, but they're still all there. And it's important, I think, when we look back to understand that it is a complex, beautiful, tragic, hard, joyful world that really, when we're entirely honest with ourselves, is not very different than our own. I think about Clementine Rind and her life and the differences that she made in the 18th century without her knowing it. That in one way enabled me to sit here today and talk to all of you. So I think that would be something that I always think about when we have this time to really focus on the women who impacted not only Williamsburg, not only Virginia, but our nation as a whole, even if they are nameless or forgotten. Really quick, and I know I'm going to pass, we're running low on time. We're doing a program this spring season called Nation Builders Discuss. The topic this season is actually the institution of slavery. So if this program interests you, of what Mary and I did today, what we talked about here today, come and see Nation Builders Discuss. The program is designed to be partly in character and partly out of character, and to focus in depth on one topic. You never know which two nation builders you might get. There's a lot of really neat combinations. So I would encourage you to come see that programming as well.
Yeah, and I think for me, for parting thoughts, I just be open to history. There was so much that I have learned since being here, and it has opened my eyes and it has expanded my view of the past. But I think sometimes there's a fear that history is set, it's done. What was inked, 50 years ago is all that we should ever refer to. And the truth of the matter is, when I think about Aggie, she's a new story, but she was there all along. It just took me and some other researchers to dig out through the records this woman's life, to present her, to bring her to the forefront. That doesn't change history, it adds to history. And we're still looking and we're still striving to make sure that we are showing a more complete and full story of this period. Our nation's founding, I think, is so important to tell us who we are today. And we certainly weren't perfect then, but we weren't awful. There were a lot of great things that came from that period and a lot of terrible things, and we're dealing with those same things today. So just be open to history and be open to learning more, and I hope you'll come learn with us.
Yeah, come visit.
Such an optimistic note to end on, too, that we have so much potential and, can learn more, and maybe we will find those primary sources on our wish list. More stories to tell.
Please check your attics.
Yes. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have today. Mary, Emma, thank you guys so much for joining us. This has been fantastic.
Thank
you.
And
thank you to all of you watching who sent in questions, who listened. We really appreciate it and have really enjoyed extending this conversation to all of you at home. What we have done today would not have been possible without a generous grant from Ferguson Enterprises, and we thank them and all of our donors for that support. It is only because of you that we can share the complete and engaging story of our nation. We are so glad that you took the time to join us today, to watch with us, and we hope that we'll get to see you in person here in Colonial Williamsburg very soon. Have a wonderful day.